Okay, everybody, welcome back. So in this section, we're going to take a look now at the second step or the second building block of the foundation of getting our digital audio workstation into our analog studio, and that's talking about console emulation. So in the last video, we talked about tape machines. This time, we're going to talk about two types of console emulations to help you, again, kind of glue this whole thing together in a way that that makes it sound analog. So if you remember from the last video, we're looking out here, let's say on the kick drum track. Our first plugin was our virtual tape machine, and we looked at a series of tape machines. I left the virtual tape machine by Slate Digital up. I deleted all the other ones just to save resources on my computer, and all the tape machines are shut off. Now that's going to be the first plugin in your chain. The next plugin I want to talk to you about is the console emulation, and the first plugin I want to show you is I want to show you the Virtual Console Collection, or the VCC by Slate Digital. I own this, and I also own the Waves NLS nonlinear summing plugin, which we'll look at in a few minutes. Okay, now what console emulation is going to do, it's going to do exactly what it says. These plugins, and this one in particular, the VCC, is where they went ahead and they modeled or emulated 6 different consoles, the input and the output transformers, to give you that kind of console sound and vibe. So we're going to take a look at one here. We're going to listen to one here, but I'm going to walk you through this plugin and kind of show you how it works. And then I urge you to go out and take a look and demo at this at slatedigital.com if you find this something that you want to try. So the way this plugin is laid out, this is really a two-part plugin. When you buy the Virtual Console Collection as part of the VMR, or the Virtual Mix Rack, which is what you see here, this 500 series mix rack, you get two parts of the VCC. You get the virtual channel, which goes on all your individual channels. And then if I pin this and I move this over to the right, and then you also get the virtual mix bus, which goes on all your buses and your main out, which is what I have here. Okay, they're laid out exactly the same, but the mix bus, they modeled the mix bus transformers of the console in question, where on the virtual channel, the blackface, they actually modeled an individual channel or channel strip on that console, the input transformer and the output transformer of the console on the channel strip, as opposed to the mix bus. Makes sense? So it's going to have a little bit different of a sound characteristic, so you kind of use these in conjunction with each other. So let's just walk through the virtual channel, the layout, so you can kind of see what this does. So over here at the top in the middle, we have our nice display. Under that, we have the input side here on the left. We have the output side on the right. So the more you crank up the input, the more signal you're going to drive into this plugin, and we'll demonstrate this in a few minutes. And then if you want to push the console a little harder and drive more signaling, you can compensate by turning down the output to level match the plugin, which is always a good idea. These are now not linked, but you can link them together just by clicking this button. And now when you turn the input up or down, the output moves along with it. Above that, we have a group I/O, which I'll talk about in a second. I usually leave that off. In the center here is probably the most important part of this plugin. This is the selector switch for the 6 different consoles that Slate Digital has emulated. We start off here in the bottom left-hand corner, which is the one we're going to kind of listen to this time, is the Brit 4KE, which is an SSL E4000 console. We also have a Brit 4KG, which is the G Series 4000 console by SSL. Both these are SSLs. The USA is an API console. The Brit N is a Neve console. This little funky little symbol here, little pitchfork looking symbol, is a Trident console. And then finally we have here an RC2, which some people will say is like the TG12345, or one of the old red consoles from Abbey Road Studios from the 50s and 60s. Down here, and they all sound a little bit different from each other, and we'll dial through and we'll listen to a couple of them. Down here we have a drive knob. The more we turn up the drive, the more harmonic distortion we're going to get. Anything above 12 noon, you're going to start clipping, which could be desired or not be desired. And then we have this grouping selector, which I really like, because what we can do here, and what we do is, you see I have everything on group 1. So what that means is, if I put this on all of my tracks and turn them all to group 1, and let's say I want to audition different consoles across my entire mix, all I have to do is turn the selector switch on one of the plugins, and all of them will change because it's grouped. Make sense? And again, I'll demonstrate this. We have a noise reduction button here if you want to get rid of some of the hiss and some of the noise. I tend to leave this off because I want some of that hiss and noise, because that's part of the sound of the plugin. Although I suppose if you had a really large session with 50, 60, 70 tracks, maybe all the noise would get to be too much cumulative across the mix, but I typically will leave this disengaged. And then we have a group bypass, and the group bypass is powerful because, again, if we have everything grouped, when we turn this on and off, we're not only turning it off on the plugin here, but we're also turning them off on all of the instances across the mix. So you can get a quick A/B on how the plugin is affecting the entire mix. Make sense? And again, I'll show that to you in a minute. So that is the virtual channel part of this plugin. Again, the virtual bus, the mix bus part of the plugin, this happens to be the master out, is laid out exactly the same way. All the controls are exactly the same. So if I were just to show you, if I were to pin this here, and now I were to open up the one on the kick track again, just to show you the grouping feature. So again, when I group bypass, you'll see also I click group bypass on the mix bus, it turns it off and bypasses the plugin on the kick track. If I were to change consoles, you can see as I'm changing it on one, it changes it on another, which again is a great way for you to be able to audition different consoles across your entire mix. If I turn up the drive on one, it's going to turn it up on the other. Anything that I do in these bottom three controllers, the selector, the drive, and the group, are all going to change together. Noise reduction, same thing. Bypass, same thing. The only thing that's different is because I disabled this group I/O, if I turn up the input up or down on the mix bus, it's not going to change on the channel because I disabled this group I/O. I have to enable it here and enable it on all the channels. Oops. So it would work together. Okay. I like to keep these deselected because every track, you know, the input and output's not going to be exactly the same depending on how hot the signal is coming in. And the same thing with the linked I/O. I usually leave that disabled. Okay, so again, the rule of thumb is you put the mix bus part of the plugin on your master out and on any buses. So down here on my bus tracks, you'll see I also have the mix bus part of the plugin because it's a bus. On all the individual channels, you put the virtual channel, which is the blackface that I just showed you here. Okay, so now what we're going to do, again, the tape machines are turned off. The only thing that we're listening to is this console on the VCC. We're looking at it across and listening to it across all the drums, the bass, and the two electric guitars like we did in the last video with the tape machines, just to keep things consistent. So the way I like to set this up is pretty simple. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the first instance of this, okay, once I got it all set up, and I'm just going to listen back to the track, and I'm going to see how we're hitting the console on each individual track. Here happens to be the kick track. So if I were to solo up the kick, okay, and I kind of just turn this on here. Okay. Now, if I want to turn up the input, you're going to see we're going to start clipping. On a kick track, that's probably not desirable, but that's how that kind of works. So as you turn up the input, if you wanted to hit the console a little harder, you should turn down the output to compensate. Okay. Now, what I like to do and the way I like to set the input most of the time is I'm just looking to come in and just maybe, you know, I really don't want this needle to really go into the red unless I'm looking to have something sound like it's clipping. And that's typically not what I would do, especially on drums. I just wanted to hit somewhere around maybe 12 noon, you know, something like this. I may turn it up a little bit just to give a little bit of extra signal. The more signal you push in, the more coloration you're going to get. The drive, again, the more you turn this up, the more kind of coloration you're going to get. I don't typically play with this too much. I kind of throw it up at around noon most times and kind of leave it alone for the most part. Okay, now on this one track, you're not going to hear much of a difference across one track. But once I get it kind of set up to this point, then I'll move over to the next track. And in our case is the snare. Okay, same kind of thing. And get hitting it, but we're not killing it. Okay. Again, keep the drive right around that noon. Hi-hats. There we go. Turn that down a little bit. Okay, and I just move through the tracks one at a time. Okay, we don't really have the tom hits here. I'm not sure where they are, but I know we're probably just going to crank this up a little bit just to keep this thing kind of moving along. And again, we're on right now. All the consoles are set to the Brit 4KE, which is the SSL 4000. That's another tom track. I'm not going to audition each tom here to keep this video somewhat short, but you would audition each track, set your input and your outputs. And again, you got to experiment with this to see what you like, but this is, I'm showing you typically how I set these things up. Tom 4. Oops, that's the wrong plugin. That'll come in a few minutes. Okay, there was a hit on that low tom. We're going to have to crank that up quite a bit. Let's get to the overheads. Again, I don't want to slam it too much. See, on its heaviest hits, it might clip a little bit. That might be a little much. I'm going to back it off a little. The room. Okay, we'll turn down our output a little. Our bass guitar. Now that's hitting it pretty heavy. So maybe I'll turn this down. And then I'll turn up the output to compensate. Okay. Here's our first electric guitar. Okay, and same thing, we're clipping, so let's turn this down. Okay, so now once I have all my tracks set, I'm going to go over to my bus, and I'm going to check my buses because the signal's flowing into the buses, right? So here's our drum bus. Yeah, it looks pretty good. This is our bass bus. Now, keep in mind on your buses, and obviously you probably know this, but it's worth mentioning, you know, I just threw up these faders and did a quick mix for our tutorial purpose. When we get to the real mix later on in this series, you'll see me dialing, obviously, a much better mix. And depending on where this fader is, will depend on how much signal is going into our buses. So I would set the channel portion of the Virtual Console collection. And then once I kind of dial in the mix from a fader point of view, then I'll go ahead and final tweak my buses. I'm always going back and forth, so I thought that was worth mentioning. Here's our guitars. So like I would turn this up a little. Like that. Hit a little harder. Okay, now I'm going to go down to my mix bus on the master out and do the same thing. See how we're doing it cumulatively. Looks pretty good. I'll pretty much leave it alone. Okay, so now once I kind of set it up, and again, depending on the console that I pick may dictate how much more I want to drive or less drive the console as far as the input and output and the drive knob. Okay, this is something you have to experiment with. We're not going to spend the whole series going through every little facet of every plugin, because part of this is to kind of just give you an introduction. If you already have these plugins, you know what I mean, and if you don't, you want to go demo them and experiment. So depending on the console, you may decide to drive the console a little more or a little less. You get the idea. Now what I'd like to do is I want to show you, again, just by having this one plugin, and that's all we're listening to, right? The tape machines are off, and the plugin after this is disabled at this point too, because we're going to talk about that plugin in a minute. And with no EQ, no compression, no nothing, all we did was threw up the faders and got a kind of a little bit of a mix, whatever, rough mix, right? Static mix. What this plugin can do for you. Now again, like I've said in the last section, you need to be listening to this on good studio monitors or headphones, because if you're listening to this on an earbuds or on a smartphone or a tablet, you may not hear the subtle differences. This console, just like the tape machine in the last section, it's subtle. Some are a little more obvious than others, but it's a subtle effect. That's why on the kick track, when I bypassed it, you probably didn't hear any difference. It's the cumulative effect to give the whole mix a sense of continuity and vibe. So let me demonstrate. So remember when I said when I have everything grouped, so if I turn off this, it's turning them off across all the channels, right? So I'm just going to toggle this on and off as we listen back to this loop of music and see if you can hear the difference between before and after, okay? So here is with it, and then I'll take it away, and you'll hear how the mix will fall a little flat. Okay, right now it's not perfectly level matched, so let's do this on the bus, just so I can level match it a little bit better for you. Again, I would take a lot more care and time, and you'll see me do this in the mix section of the series, believe me. So we're not overly loud. So right here, I'm going to turn down the output a little bit. Okay, there we go. So now remember, when I hit bypass, it's also turning it off on all the channels. It's bypassing the plugin across the entire mix. Drums, bass, guitars. Okay, so with it, this is what we get, and then I'm going to bypass it. And you may want to turn up the volume in your headphones or the volume in your studio a little bit. I have it a little conservative so I don't clip the video. So go ahead, turn them up. I'm not going to blast you so you can hear the difference. Here we go without. This is with the console, and then I'll take it away. Here's with. Bypassed. Okay, so what you should hear there is you should hear the guitars get a lot more open, a little bit more brighter. The snare gets a little bit more bright. The kick gets a little bit thicker, but the kick needs to be EQ'd and compressed still too. Remember, this is an compressed, un-EQ'd session thus far, which is the best way to demonstrate these plugins, because you can hear once you EQ and compress everything, this will have a much more dramatic effect. Okay, so you can hear that. Again, it's subtle. It's not exact. You know, the level matching is pretty darn close, but you get the idea. The mix kind of folds in on itself when you take this away, and when you bring this in, it kind of opens up a little bit. So listen to the top ends. Pay attention to the crack of the snare and the guitars. Okay, just gives it a little flavor. A little bit more of a, for lack of a better term, a hi-fi sound, a little more polished, a little bit more professional sounding, right? And this is just one plugin, okay? Now, think about to the section before where we talked about the tape machine. You lay the tape machine on with this, and now you have a little tape machine coloration, a little console coloration. We start building some vibe to this song. Okay, once we add the channel strip in the next section, now you're going to hear the whole mix come together, but I digress. So now what you can do here, and this is what I don't do, but just like with the tape machine, on all the tracks, I want to use the same console. The drive can change from track to track depending on how it's recorded, but I want to keep it on the same console as opposed to using different consoles on every groups of instruments. Some engineers will say put all their drums, they'll use, say, the SSL 4000 E series like we're doing. And then when they get to guitars, they may use the API, because an API console is known to be really awesome sounding with electric guitars, especially rock distorted guitars. And then vocals, they may use, say, the Neve. You can do that. The reason why I don't do that is, again, if you think back to what I said early on, is I'm trying to think of this like my analog studio. And in my analog studio, when I recorded this back in the day, I didn't have 3 consoles in the studio at once, right? I had one console, and the whole band recorded through the same console, whether it's a Neve, an SSL, API, doesn't matter. Okay, now some would say, well, you know, back in the day, two bands, sometimes they would record all their drums in one particular studio because they liked the sound of that room and they liked the sound of the desk. And then maybe for vocals, they went to another studio and they recorded through a different console. That's true. But let's not complicate things. Again, just thinking about if I was in an old school studio, how would I do this? So to give this rock track, in this case, the kind of SSL vibe, I want to put all the tracks on the SSL. Okay, if I didn't want the SSL vibe and I wanted the Neve vibe, I put them all on the Neve. You get the idea. It's the same concept when we talked about the tape machine with the 15 inches per second and the 30 inches per second and the tape type. We said on all the tracks, keep it the same. So it gives it that sense of continuity and glue. That's the way I like to work. But in the digital world, you could do whatever the heck you want. There's no rules. But again, the whole point of this series is saying, how do we try to stay as true to analog as possible? And this is one way to do it, okay? So that is the VCC by Slate Digital. Now what we can do is we could cycle through, and I will do this. Again, if I cycle through the consoles, it's going to change on all the tracks. So if we start on the SSL, I'm going to move it through all 6 consoles. Again, turn up your volume a little bit. You're going to hear some subtle differences. Some of them will be more obvious than others. They're not worlds apart from each other, but they all have a little bit of a different tonal characteristic. And depending on the mix and the type of the song, you may decide to pick one console or another, okay? So we're going to start on the SSL 4000 E series, then we're going to move to the G, we're going to move to the API, we're going to move around as we go, okay? So here we go. Right now we are on the SSL 4000 E series. Okay, so hopefully you can hear the differences. Some of them are a little more obvious than others. Again, I listen for the snare. The crack of the snare is where you kind of hear the most obvious difference. But as you can hear, hopefully, when you cycle around through the consoles, you get a slightly different tone. Okay, are they magically different from each other? No. So, you know, sometimes, you know, again, it's all horses for courses. It's whatever you like. This is very subjective, this topic. So, you know, what I like and you like might be two different things. It's fine. Typically, when I'm using this plugin, I usually use one of maybe 3 consoles. I use either the Brit 4KE, the Neve, because those are much different from each other compared to the other ones. And then sometimes I'll use the API. I rarely use the Trident, the RC Tube. It's just, to me, there's, you know, I pick a console and I go. A lot of it is dictated by what channel strip I'm going to use, which we'll talk about in the next section. And I have channel strips for all of these different consoles, except for the Trident. They don't make a channel strip for that yet. So again, if I just cycle between the E series and the Neve, you'll hear the largest difference. Much warmer on the RC Tube. The Neve tends to have a more open sound. And that's if I take it completely away. There's with it back. Okay, so hopefully you get the vibe. You can kind of hear what we're doing. Again, it's subtle, but it's the next building block, okay, to thinking about our analog studio. So now one other console emulation plugin I want to show you. I'm going to shut all these off on the VCC just to turn them all off so we can stay consistent here. I want to show you the NLS by Waves. Okay, now the NLS does the same thing as the VCC. They model the console. The difference with the there's a few differences between the two. The NLS only has 3 consoles, whereas the VCC has 6. Okay, the NLS has what's called a spike, which is an SSL, a mic, which is the one I like the most in this plugin, which is the TG12345 console by EMI, and the Nevo, which is a Neve. Okay, so you have 3 consoles here as opposed to 6. You have a drive knob. This is the bus portion of the plugin. Just like with the VCC, you have a plugin that goes on the bus. It's like a 2-part plugin. And then you also have the plugin that goes on the channel. Okay, so it's the same kind of thing. They just look a little different. Okay, so we have VCA groups where we can group things together, like we talked about. We have a noise bypass. We can bypass the plugin completely, just like on the VCC. And then we have these VCA faders down here, which is a little different than the VCC, where you could do things where you can group things together, again, by instruments. So, for example, you can group all your drums to group 1, and then you can choose what console you want. You can do, say your guitars are group 2 and choose a different console if you wanted to, like we just talked about, which I don't typically do, but you can. You have a drive knob for each one of those, okay? And then you can also bypass the noise, and you can bypass each individual group, okay? So it looks a little bit more complicated, but it in essence does the same thing. Here's the difference. Here's one of the bigger differences between this and the VCC outside of what I just mentioned. The difference here is, and again, here's the bus portion of the plugin, which is on the master out. And then on our buses, we have the same thing, right? The NLS. Oh, let me shut off all the VCCs here. We don't want to double console ourselves here. So we're going to turn on those. So you can see on the buses, again, same thing. I have the bus portion of the plugin, and I have it on the wrong one. It should be on the mic, okay? And then let's see. Again, I try to choose the same console. We're going to listen to the TG12345 emulation just because it's different from the VCC. Okay, so once you pick it for 1, let me just do this one more time. Okay, so now we're on the mic. So here, on the individual channels, here is the kick. Let me just turn them all on. Once again, there we go. Okay, so here's the kick. Here's the channel. We're on the mic. The difference, one of the main differences between this and the VCC is that the VCC, they modeled, for example, the SSL that we're looking at, the input and the output transformer of one of the channels on an SSL. Which one? We don't know, but one of them. So if you had a 48 channel board, they picked a channel, probably the one that sounded best to them. They modeled that channel, okay? Now, the thing about an analog desk is, one of the things that kind of people don't realize is, each one of those channels, fader 1, fader 2, the input side of fader 1, the input side of fader 2, the input and output transformers may be the same brand, but they're different components. They're going to sound a little different. The circuitry, the diodes, the capacitors, and all the stuff that makes all the analog circuitry that makes up that channel strip on channel 1 is going to sound a little different than channel 2. And again, we're talking subtleties, but it's going to sound a little different. And it's been known that certain engineers would use certain consoles in certain studios. And for example, they may know that in one studio, they were working on a Neve console, and track channel 8 maybe sounded really good on vocals in that studio, better than on any other track on the board. And they would kind of know what instruments they'd want to put on certain tracks because they may have a unique sound to them. And you say, well, how can that be? Well, all the components are the same, but they're not. They're physically different components. Certain components, wear faster than others. There's certain tolerances that are not the same when you talk about analog components. Depending on how well the board was maintained by the studio, you can have some components that were in the process of degrading and dying, and they add a different sound to it. All that stuff kind of, you throw it all into the soup. It all kind of makes up for the sound of that particular desk. And I know we're getting a little bit further ahead here, and we're kind of complicating this a little more, but again, I'm trying to impress upon you the thought process behind this, okay? So what Waves did, which is pretty clever, is not only did they just model any old channel on the board and said that's the one for our plugin, they modeled all the channels on the board. And the way you know that, here's the kick track, for example. So if I go over to load and I go to my mic, which is my TG12345, you see there's 32 tracks here. So they modeled each one of the individual channel strips on this TG12345 desk. Okay, so what you would do, and the way I have this set up here, is if the kick was going into track 1, I would pick mic, track 1. If I go over to my snare version of this plugin, okay, and I go to load and go to mic, you can see it's on track 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way through all my tracks. So each one of these is going to sound slightly different. And on its own, you're not really going to hear any difference. But the cumulative effect of that is going to give you, across, in our case, 12 tracks, it's going to give us a little bit more authenticity, I suppose you can say, to what it would be like if you went through the desk. You'd be going through separate channels. That's a unique feature to this that's not part of the Slate Digital. So again, the way I set this up is exactly the same as we did before. So I would go through, and we'll do this in real time together. Okay, I'll go through one track at a time, the kick. And again, I'll bring up the kick. And the way I would turn up the input here is I would just turn up the drive if I wanted to drive it more, which I don't want to do. You know, we're just kind of hitting it, you know, somewhere up around the 12 noon. Okay, we can also turn... If we turn up the drive, we could turn down the output, okay? All right, so that's kind of our kick. And then if I go to our snare, okay, that looks okay already. I'm not going to really drive it anymore. You know, sometimes on a snare, if you want a little dirt, you can hear it gets a little bit more crispy. Maybe that's something we want to do. Again, you'd have to experiment. Okay. Our toms, we're just going to kind of do what we did on the last one because we don't have... There we go. There's a tom hit. Tom 3. And I would take a lot more care with the toms in the mix. This is just for demonstration. Okay, so now we're using the stereo part of this plugin because this is a stereo track. Yeah, sometimes I'll drive the overheads a little. Get a little more crack in the snare. The rooms. Now again, we'll go down and check our buses. Oh, I gotta do my bass first. Here we go. Bass looks good, guitar 1. Here's our drum bus. Our bass bus. Hardly any signal there at all. Check our bass track here. cars. There's our master bus. Okay, so I kind of just set them, and again, you can see how quick I move through this. I would take a little more care, as I said, but honestly, I don't spend too much time sweating over the details on the console. I just want to kind of hit the needle halfway up, pretty much. I don't try to get too crazy and make a science project out of it. Okay, because I would do more of that when we get to the channel strip in the next series. So now again, to just turn on and off all of these, all at the same time here, with the NLS, so you can hear the cumulative effect. Before, after. Okay, so that is the NLS by Waves, which is again a great plugin. Your next logical question is probably, well, which one do you like better, Dave? Do you like the VCC or do I like the Waves NLS better? I wouldn't say, again, any of them are better. They're just a little different. Let me bring up the NLS so you can look at both of them here. I tend to use the VCC more, only because I've had it longer. I'm more comfortable with it. I like the fact there's 6 different consoles as opposed to only 3. However, if I'm doing a mix where I want to use the TG12345 channel strip, which we'll look at in another video, I will use the Waves NLS just for this mic console because I like the coloration of the mic. The spike and the Neve, not something that I prefer over the VCC by Slate Digital. So these are both really good plugins. Again, they're affordable. The Waves one I know you can pick up during different parts of the year. Waves always have sales. You could probably pick this up for $30, which is a hell of a deal. And again, it just adds a little bit more coloration to our overall vibe, kind of like the tape machine. And now between the tape machine and between the console, we now have what I call the foundation of our analog studio. And then the next step in the next video, we're going to talk about, or the next section, we're going to talk about the channel strip and how I use channel strips in conjunction with the console and the tape machine to kind of finish off the foundation of our analog studio. Because now we have, like, we're really recording through a real tape machine and a real analog console. Okay, so I hope you found this video helpful. Come on back for the next section where we start talking about channel strips. And if you haven't done so already, if you have either one of these consoles, you should load them up into your session along with me. And or if you have not ever used these, go out to slatedigital.com, go out to waves.com. You can demo them for free for I think 14 days or so. Check them out, play with them, get out the manual, read up, learn what all these different knobs do and how to use them. I just gave you a brief overview because this is not a series about how to use each plugin in its finest detail, but to kind of give you the overall philosophy on why you would use something like this. Okay, so come on back for the next section and we will start talking about the channel strip.